This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross. He's editor of WizPolitics.com. Hi, J.R. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, anytime.
All right, so let's start with the state budget for this week. About 54% of the state's Medicaid funding comes from the federal government, but Republican co-chairs of the Joint Finance Committee brushed off concerns about the impact of looming federal cuts. What's the latest on this and on negotiations between GOP leaders and Democratic Governor Tony Evers?
Well, first we got some new numbers from the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, the nonpartisan budget arm of the legislature. What they're telling us is we're still in decent shape. Remember, the budget's a 2-year period. The current one ends June 30th. We're actually going to have a little bit more money than we thought in the state's main checking account when that's over, about $4.3 billion, about $70 million more than we thought before. So in the context of the budget, not a whole lot, but better than having less. Same time, we're going to have less in revenue growth over the next 2-year period from 2025 through 2027. That's important because you talk about Medicaid, that's ongoing money. The surplus is one-time funds. So if you take one-time money, spend it for an ongoing cost, you create a hole down the road that you got to take care of, either through revenue growth or cuts elsewhere. So what I'm watching for, one, is how they address that. Medicaid, for example, just the cost to continue our current program as is about $1.6 billion in general purpose revenue, which is more money we're going to bring in for new revenue growth the next 2 years. Doesn't leave much to fund schools or other things, tax cuts, without dipping into your surplus. That surplus, you could do whatever you want with it. You can pay for ongoing costs, but again, it creates an issue for you to deal with 2 years down the road. Some lawmakers have proposed doing a tax rebate. That's a one-time use of the money. Not sure if that's going to happen. Others want to use it for building projects you can take care of without borrowing costs long-term. But there are ideas floating around. What we don't know for sure is what the deal looks like that Devin LeMahieu, Robin Vos, the two leaders of the legislature for Republicans, and Governor Tony Evers want to strike. They met in person March 26th. We know that. Since then, staff have been meeting about the budget and taxes and everything else. Both Vos, the Assembly Speaker, and LeMahieu, the Assembly Leader, have been calling for Evers to meet with him directly again, start hammering out a deal. The governor, though, has been saying through his staff, hey, we can have our staffs continue to meet. They'll hammer out these proposals, get to us close to a final deal. When we have a deal in place, I'll come in and sign that thing and we'll knock it out. It looks like Robin and Devin want the governor face-to-face to negotiate. The governor wants the staff to basically take care of those discussions and then sign off on the deal. Who's going to blink, we'll see. But we're getting now to the point where it's mid-May or past mid-May. The fiscal year ends June 30th. Now, there's no repercussion for Wisconsin if we go past June 30th. That's not a big deal. But the longer this goes on, we don't have the answers how we're going to spend our money or do tax cuts for the next 2 years. It's kind of like people are antsy for an answer of what's going on with the state's budget. So kind of watch and see to get this thing rolling sometime soon and get going on it.
So can you explain for a layperson the difference between funding ongoing projects and funding one-time projects and how that plays out with how Wisconsin pays for things? And if you could focus on something like Medicaid, just sort of unpack that.
Well, let's take a tax cut. That's an easy one to do. So one-time money. If I give you a rebate, so let's say let's make it easy. We've got $1 million in a surplus. I'm going to give people $1 million tax rebate. Everybody gets a check. That's a one-time expense, right? You pay for that one-time rebate, that's it. Now, if you reduce tax rates, right, use that $1 million to reduce the rates, well, those rates are going to be reduced not just for that 2-year period of the budget that costs you $1 million, but for every 2 years after that as well. That's an ongoing cost. Medicaid, you have ongoing costs because it gets more expensive every year to do Medicaid between prescription drugs and everything else. Those costs go up. Now, the governor, he wants to expand Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act. He's proposed that, I think, all 4 budgets, all 4 times Republicans have ripped it out of the budget, saying we don't want to expand welfare. And what the expansion is, right now, Medicaid covers up to 100% of the federal poverty limit in Wisconsin. You can, if you want to, as a state, cover people between 100% and 133% through the program. The other option, which Wisconsin has taken, is putting people in that range into the exchanges that are part of the Affordable Care Act. It's basically insurance that they purchased, the exchange with assistance and stuff like that. Anyway, if you expand Medicaid, you get more federal money because you expanded it. That would help take care of those ongoing costs. But because we're not doing that, it requires more state tax dollars to pay for those programs. That's an ongoing cost we have going forward. And look, we're getting older in Wisconsin, including myself, getting closer to retirement age all the time. And so those costs are going to continue to go up as our population grows of those over 65 are eligible for the program.
How is that interacting with what Congress and what President Trump is trying to do with the slicing funding for Medicaid overall in the federal budget?
Well, that's a great question because we're trying to get a straight answer, like what it's going to look like. We know that they want to do things like work requirements, right? That's been put out there. The question is, when would that go into place? So, in fact, you would tell people on the program, hey, we're going to make sure that if you're able-bodied, that you're working to qualify for Medicaid. Okay, well, when might that kick in? How do you do the eligibility checks? How do you check if people are actually working? People would probably lose their coverage from Medicaid if they don't meet certain qualifications. That's a big question, how that's going to happen. They've talked about reducing, the key word, the catchphrase for Republicans is fraud, waste, and abuse, right? But that's in the eye of the beholder. Other folks who say the people who are on the program, they should be there. But they haven't really been able to knock out that bill yet in the House, so we know exactly what it's going to look like. And they have to negotiate with the U.S. Senate, see what they want to do. And oh, by the way, I hate to bring politics up, but it affects everything. Medicaid reductions aren't real popular right now, if you look at the polls. So there are a lot of Republicans who are in swing seats saying, might not be great for me next fall when I go face the voters. I'm not sure I want to do this.
You're tuned into Capitol Notes. I'm WEWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the budget and about important programs like Medicaid. What's the possibility of a prison reform package? Evers has proposed closing Green Bay Correctional Institution while modernizing Waupun and expanding the state's early release program.
Well, there's a good example of something that you could use some of that surplus for a one-time expense like building some new prisons or remodeling prisons, right? Like that's what you can, rather than borrowing the money, that might be a way to use some of those funds. What's interesting is the governor often has proposed lots of big ideas and found an unreceptive audience in the legislature. He has done a great job, people will tell you, of trying to lobby folks to get on board with his ideas. He oftentimes kind of says, here it is, you guys should do this. He did do a little more legwork this time, for what I've been told by my sources, where he brought in Republican lawmakers, showed them some of his ideas before he announced it to the public, but they weren't on the ground floor. And so Republicans, one, rarely, if ever, give Evers a true win on anything. They always put their stamp on it. And two, they've got some concerns about things like the expanding earned early release, more drug and alcohol treatment in the prisons. You could earn getting out earlier. They've got concerns about that. He wants to close Green Bay and not build a new prison. They've got concerns about that because you would reduce the capacity we have in our prison system right now. We are above capacity. Republicans aren't thrilled with the idea of releasing more people, even though they earned it through these various programs. They have a concern about that. So they're going to put their own stamp on the program. The question is, what's it look like? Will the job training effort at Waupun survive what they want to do? Will they try to propose a new prison in Green Bay? The challenge is going to be there is a philosophical difference between Evers and GOP lawmakers on a number of things, but one key thing here is prison capacity. Evers is not going to expand our capacity right now. What I'm wondering is if Republicans come in with a new prison in Green Bay and keep it capacity as it is, will the governor be okay with that? Because remember, he ran in 2018 on trying to reduce our prison population. We have a higher incarceration rate than lots of other states. People I talk to can't see the governor going for an increase in the capacity, but could he go for keeping it at the same level? That's a key question in that debate.
Interesting. Okay. Well, something else that was happening last week was the Senate Committee on Licensing, Regulatory Reform, State and Federal Affairs. It held a public hearing on a GOP bill that's aiming to enlist county sheriffs to aid ICE. Now, immigration is all over the news. It's a big key component of the Trump administration's efforts. They're doing a crackdown. Local Republicans are trying to respond to that. What's important to know there?
The bill already passed the Assembly, so we know Republicans are behind it. It'll probably pass the Senate, but it's going to be a party line vote again. And so it looks like the governor, if I had to bet, will probably veto that one. He hasn't seemed real thrilled about it so far. So it's a lot of messaging right now about immigration. Now, one of the questions is, how is that going to play next fall? Now, Evers has not said he's going to seek a third term, but Republicans have looked at his numbers in the polls, and he's consistently been around 50%, give or take a few points here or there. They want to paint him as out of touch with Wisconsinites in general. And if you look at the polls, the public in general supports efforts to take people who are undocumented and remove them from the country. They like the idea of law enforcement cooperating with federal immigration officials. So can Republicans message that in a way to paint the governor as out of touch and extreme, quote unquote, compared with the average Wisconsinite on that issue? And the other thing is, will that issue resonate next fall in the elections, even if they are successful in painting the governors out of touch with the average Wisconsinite on that issue?
Where are you getting the information that people are on board with county sheriffs or local
seeing polling,
law enforcement?
polling that people now, it depends how you ask the question, right? So if you ask about like removing somebody who's here who has a criminal offense, that's pretty much broad support. Somebody who's been here for years and has a job and is, being productive, if you want to use that word, that's a much different question to ask. But generally speaking, if you're talking people who are here who have are undocumented, have criminal offenses, there's broad support in the polls that I've seen for those policies from the Trump administration to remove those folks. Now, again, depends on where you go with that question, right? The case, the guy out in Maryland who was moved to a prison in Central America, that's a whole different ball of wax, right? I'm talking general broad strokes about where the polling is at when it comes to immigration enforcement in this country.
And what is this bill specifically asking for? It's asking to do differently. So right now, ICE can issue an administrative warrant and people can be booked into the jail, and the sheriff's department doesn't have to ask them what their immigration status is or to let ICE know if they happen to be undocumented, right?
Yeah, and it has also a hammer there, a penalty that if you don't cooperate, you lose 15% of, I believe it's 15% of your shared revenue, which is state aid to local governments. That is like the stick they want to use to try and compel enforcement or compliance. I think it's like Dane County, Milwaukee County, maybe a couple others that aren't quote unquote in compliance right now. And that would be a punishment for them. They lose money. That's another concern Evers has raised about having that in there.
I see. Okay. Well, speaking more about Republicans and political approaches to next fall, the state GOP had its convention this weekend. It's their first convention since conservative-backed Brad Schimmel lost the state Supreme Court race by 10 points. What can you tell us about that?
Really, I'm kind of looking forward to what their answer is going to be to the problem they have in spring elections. Brian Schimming, the state party chair, ahead of the convention, initiated this post-mortem about what happened in April. It's the second straight Supreme Court race that the conservative candidate lost by double digits. They would know what's wrong, like what happened. They were riding high in November after Trump won Wisconsin. Only the third time Republicans won Wisconsin since like the 80s, right? Like that was a big thing for them. They came crashing down in April because the April electorate has shifted in Wisconsin. When I started doing this 25 years ago, spring elections, Republicans had the advantage. Anybody will tell you that the electorate was just more Republican. Now it's shifted. Those reliable voters around every election, they're more likely to be Democrats. And so Democrats have an advantage in spring elections. Schimming wants this postmortem and see like what can they do differently and how they approach the 2026 race. Rebecca Bradley, conservative on the court, is up for re-election. She's indicated she's plans to run. What do they do differently? Well, I'm also curious, what answers are they going to get from that report they don't already know? They know the electorate has shifted. They know the state Democratic Party raised more money than they do. They know these things. What else could they do differently to bring out more conservative voters in the spring? That is going to be a huge question for them going forward, not just this spring, but the spring of 27, when Annette Ziegler, another conservative, her term's up in the court for another 10-year term on the bench.
Okay, so last week the state Supreme Court set up a timeline for arguments on two petitions for original action on congressional redistricting. What can you tell us about that? What's the difference between those two petitions?
So you need a history lesson. Go back to 2011. Republicans had control of the legislature and the governor's office and passed bills that had new maps for the legislature and for the congressional districts. Fast forward to 2021. Democrat Governor Tony Evers, Republican lawmakers can't agree on maps. The state Supreme Court says when you submit maps to us, you have to take a least change approach to what was done in 2011. Ultimately, the court picked Evers' congressional map and the legislature's legislative lines. 2023, now you have a liberal majority. That court takes up a challenge to the legislative maps and says there's a constitutional issue with those maps. Along with that, we don't believe the least change approach works. It's not a good foundation for a map. 2024, Mark Elias, who's a big Dem attorney, files a request to the Supreme Court. Hey, you should redraw those congressional lines. If least change isn't good for legislative maps, it's not good for congressional ones. Court says no. So now we have these two petitions filed with the court, asking the justice to take the case directly. It's called a petition for original action without making it go to the lower courts. They have one thing in common. They both argue that least change, if it's not a good policy for the legislative maps, then you can't have congressional ones based on least change. Well, problem number one is the court already unanimously rejected taking a case on that premise. Now, can the court change its mind? Absolutely you can. So let's keep that in mind. Number two, one of the lawsuits argues that the districts are malapportioned. If you take Wisconsin's population, divide it among 8 districts, at least back when the maps are drawn, you could have districts that only has a difference of one person in the population in each district. Right now, we have a couple that have a difference of 2 people. I'm not an attorney, I always say. I've talked to some, and it's a high bar to get a court throughout the maps based on that you're off by 2 people, not 1. But, it's an interesting question of how much can you have a deviation of population in a district. That lawsuit also argues that there are too many counties that are split as the districts are formed. So it's not the entire county in one district. Now, one lawsuit is filed by Elias again. He's back. It argues that the maps are a partisan gerrymander. I think a quintessential partisan gerrymander he wrote in the brief. Basically saying you've got a map that right now have 6 Republican seats, 2 Democratic ones, was drawn for a partisan purpose. Now, there's a problem with that. One, I'm not going to argue about whether you can have a partisan gerrymander or not. But the reason that map was drawn was not to be a partisan gerrymander. It was drawn to make the incumbents happy. You have to go back to 2011. When that map was drawn, there was a lawsuit, and it challenged the map. In that lawsuit, the chief of staff for Paul Ryan gave a deposition. He testified about drawing that map. It wasn't lawmakers in the Capitol who drew it. It was basically the delegation consulting with each other. This guy said that he went around at the direction of Paul Ryan, asked members what they wanted in the map to address their concerns. Now, Sean Duffy, who was at the time a brand new lawmaker in the 7th District, North Wisconsin, he wanted to, quote, shore up his district because he won a seat that had been in Democratic hands for 40 years, basically. The rest of them, though, they wanted things like Tammy Baldwin and Tom Petri, both in the delegation, wanted to make sure their districts weren't too big. They didn't want to drive too far to go see their constituents. They wanted to be easier to go see people and meet with their constituents. Reed Ribble, who was the member for the Green Bay Area 8th District, he said, hey, got to make my seat bigger. I wouldn't mind having Calumet County because I got property down there. So it wasn't really a partisan intent in drawing the map. If you're going to argue it's a partisan gerrymander, you kind of might have to prove intent. That's not the intent that we saw, at least from that deposition. Now, again, lawyers can make other arguments, but if that's your foundation, you're going to have a hard time proving intent based off that deposition from more than a decade ago.
So ultimately, in boiling it down very briefly, though, the difference between the 2 petitions, what would it be?
One argues partisan gerrymander, one argues malapportionment. They both argue least intent's no good, just throw the maps out.
Gotcha. Okay, and so your assessment stands as far as when we talked from Capitol Notes a few weeks ago that it's kind of an uphill battle for Democrats.
Yeah, it looks like it. Now, again, justices change their minds. Lawyers make good, interesting arguments. So we'll see. All the court has done right now is said, hey, you guys have the opportunity to persuade us if we should take this case. They've not taken it yet. They've not agreed to go to the merits. All they said is, we will hear your arguments if we should take this case. So Elections Commission, you've got until May 29th to tell us what you think. Everybody else, you got till May 30th. Then we'll go from there.
And because the court is liberal controlled, you don't think it's an automatic for Democrats to be able to get in, especially because in 2024 the court rejected a petition, right?
Yeah, so they've done it before. Again, justice can change their minds. That is totally allowed. But they've already said no one time. And oh, by the way, this other thing I've been told to watch for is if the Supreme Court of Wisconsin were to take this case, if it were to try and draw a new map, you would maybe get the attention of the U.S. Supreme Court. Then they might step in and say, hey, you guys can't do this, or we're taking it over, or whatnot. So the chance of having a map in 2026 that's new, not great. I mean, they could be successful, but in talking to lawyers who specialize in this area, they're skeptical that you'll see a new map in 2026 for Wisconsin.
Well, thanks as always for this background, JR, and thanks for joining me on Capitol Notes.
Anytime. Have a great day.
That was J.R. Ross, editor of WizPolitics.com, speaking with me, WUWM's Maayan Silver. Listen for our segments every other Monday with an extended segment on Lake Effect, and check out the Capitol Notes podcast wherever you get your podcasts.